Essay 240. Hey, hi everyone, this is Ravi Agarwal. So we are going to discuss about Essay 240. Whenever you hear Essay 240, what comes in your mind? Auditor responsibility relating to fraud in an audit of financial statement. Whenever you hear 240, what comes in your mind? Fraud. So what is the auditor's responsibility relating to fraud in an audit of financial statement? So whenever he is doing audit of financial statement, what is his responsibility relating to fraud? Alright, so let's best understand what is fraud. Fraud is an intentional act. What kind of act? Intentional or unintentional? Intentional act of deception means cheating. Intentional act of deception by four people: management, TCWG, employee, third party, to obtain unjust or illegal advantage. So what is fraud? An intentional act of deception by TCWG, management, employee, third party to obtain unjust or illegal advantage. Okay, mind you, we are starting from Auditpedia 2.0. In case you don't have, you can take it from me. So, fraud is an intentional act of deception by TCWG, management, employee or third party to obtain unjust or illegal advantage. What is fraud risk factor? Next, fraud risk factor is event or condition that indicates incentive, pressure to commit fraud, and opportunity to commit fraud. So what is fraud risk factor? Is nothing but is some kind of condition, some kind of event that indicates incentive to commit fraud, pressure to commit fraud, or opportunity to commit fraud. So just three things. FRF, fraud risk factor, is event condition that indicate incentive to commit fraud, pressure to commit fraud, opportunity to commit fraud. Okay, so what have we understood till now? 240 is fraud. Auditor responsibility relating to fraud in an audit of financial statement. What is fraud? Intentional act or unintentional act? Intentional act of deception by four people: TCWG, management, employee, third party, to obtain unjust or illegal advantage. What is FRF, fraud risk factor? Event condition that indicate incentive, pressure to commit fraud, or provide an opportunity to commit fraud. Okay, so tell me one more thing. Auditor is concerned with fraud that causes material misstatement in the financial statement or immaterial misstatement in the financial statement. Obviously, auditor is concerned with the fraud that causes material, that is important, misstatement, that is mistake in the financial statement. Okay, so auditor is only concerned with the fraud that causes material misstatement in the financial statement. Now tell me, what is the responsibility of management? Management responsibility. Management primary responsibility is for prevention and detection of fraud. Okay, so the primary responsibility of prevention and detection of fraud is not of auditor. No, primary responsibility for prevention and detection of the fraud is of management and TCWG. Okay, so we are discussing what is the management responsibility. Number one, primary responsibility for prevention and detection of fraud is of management, TCWG. Okay, now management also have to maintain or create a culture of honesty. Second responsibility of management, to create a culture of honesty. And lastly, there has to be some ethical behavior by management and TCWG. So three management responsibility over here. Number one, primary responsibility for prevention and detection of fraud is of management and TCWG, and there has to be a culture of honesty. Okay, and the management also has to maintain ethical behavior. Okay, management, TCWG. All right, so these three are the responsibility of management. Now, what is the responsibility of auditor? Okay, relating to fraud, obviously. All right, so number one, very simple, we've learned it in essay 200 also: to obtain reasonable assurance that financial statement as a whole are free from material misstatement, whether due to fraud or error. Okay, so what is the auditor responsibility? Primary responsibility of prevention and detection of fraud is not of auditor but of management. So what is the auditor responsibility? To obtain reasonable assurance whether financial statement as a whole are free from material misstatement. Financial statement, what kind of opinion? Reasonable assurance you have to take. Just reasonable assurance that financial statement as a whole are free from material misstatement, whether due to fraud or error. Number one. Number two, obviously, auditor has to maintain attitude of professional skepticism. Throughout the audit, he has to maintain professional skepticism. Now, there's also auditor responsibility, not primary, but it says you should try to detect fraud. Okay, the third one, non-detection of fraud increases audit risk. Auditor, listen, your responsibility. I am 240, I am telling you, non-detection of fraud increases audit risk. So you should try to detect some fraud. Okay, so that you can reduce the audit risk and the risk of inappropriate audit report. If audit rate increases, it also increases the risk of inappropriate audit report. So you should also try to detect some fraud. Okay, not your primary responsibility, but if in case you can detect fraud, you should try to. Auditor responsibility. And lastly, auditor cannot detect all fraud. Why? Because there is inherent limitation. Okay, so auditor cannot detect all fraud due to inherent limitation. So what is the responsibility of auditor? Quickly come and tell me. To obtain reasonable assurance that financial statement as a whole are free from material misstatement, whether due to fraud or error. To maintain attitude of professional skepticism. Non-detection of fraud increases audit risk. That is the risk of inappropriate audit report. And lastly, auditor obviously cannot detect all fraud. Why? Because of inherent limitation. You know it. Alright. So now, as per 240, what is the objective of auditor? This is three simple objective of auditor. Number one, identify and assess the risk of material misstatement in the financial statement due to fraud. First of all, identify the risk. Okay, identify the risk due to fraud. Number 1, identify and assess the risk of material misstatement in the financial statement due to fraud. Number 2, obtain evidence. Obtain sufficient evidence about the assessed risk due to fraud. And lastly, response to that risk. Response to appropriately to the identified and suspected fraud. Very simple, 3 objectives stated by SA 240. 1, identify the risk. Identify and assess the risk due to fraud. Identify and assess the risk of material misstatement in the financial statement due to fraud. Number 2, evidence. Obtain sufficient appropriate evidence about the assessed risk due to fraud. And lastly, respond appropriately to the identified and suspected fraud. Alright, so this was about objective as per 240. Next is requirement of SA 240. Okay, so what does SA 240 require? It says maintain professional skepticism, number 1. Then keep discussing with your engagement team. And then risk assessment procedure, RAP, risk assessment procedure. And then says risk assessment procedure and identification due to fraud. And then whenever you get audit evidence, you should also evaluate audit evidence evaluation. Response to assess risk due to fraud. Whenever you are able to identify and assess the risk, you should also respond to the assessment due to fraud. Who is saying all this? 240 is telling you. Okay, then keep communicating with management and TCWG. Who is saying all this? SA 240. Then documentation, you should also document, management representation should also be done. Okay, WR. Alright, so what is the requirement of 240? Quickly just check it. Professional skepticism, you got to maintain it throughout the audit. Keep discussing with engagement team. Discussion among engagement team. Assess risk assessment procedure, RAP. Risk assessment and identification due to fraud. Audit evidence, you got to evaluate audit evidence. Response to assess risk due to fraud. Keep communicating with management, TCWG and regulatory authority. And then documentation. And then management representation. So these are the requirement as per SA 240. Okay, now what is risk assessment procedure? What is risk assessment procedure related to fraud? Let's understand. Now here there are 4 things. Number 1, auditor shall make inquiry to management and TCWG. Auditor shall make inquiry to management and TCWG. So what all auditor is going to inquire from TCWG? Number 1, auditor is going to ask TCWG, what is the system of supervising fraud? Can you tell me what is the system of supervising fraud? Number 1. Number 2, whether there is any fraud in your knowledge, please tell me, TCWG. So here, see, we are studying risk assessment procedure. So here there are 4 points. Number 1, auditor shall make inquiry to TCWG and management. So what he is going to ask TCWG? Tell me the system of supervising fraud. He said okay. Then if there is any fraud in your knowledge, please tell me. Who is asking? Auditor is asking TCWG. Now he's inquiring from management. So what all he is going to ask? Okay, hey management assessment of risk that financial statement may be materially misstated due to fraud. So if there is any assessment of your risk that financial statement may be materially misstated, please tell me. Okay, so what auditor is asking management is inquiring. He is asking management, if your assessment of risk that financial statement may be materially misstated due to fraud, tell me now. So, and he is also asking management process to identify and respond to risk of fraud. He is saying, what is your process to identify and respond to the risk of fraud? Please tell me. And then whatever management is communicating to TCWG and employee related to fraud, please tell me. So very simple risk assessment procedure. First point, auditor will make inquiry to TCWG. What he is going to ask? System of supervising fraud. Whether there is any fraud in your knowledge, please tell me. What he is going to ask management? He will say management assessment of risk that financial statement may be materially misstated due to fraud. Tell me. Management process to identify and respond to risk. Please tell me. Management, what are you communicating with TCWG and employee? Tell me. This is risk assessment procedure. Point number 1. Here what else we do? See, auditor is going to evaluate or consider 2 things. First of all, auditor is going to evaluate unusual relationship. You know how he is going to evaluate unusual relationship that have been identified by performing analytical procedure that may indicate any risk of material misstatement due to fraud. So auditor is going to evaluate unusual relationship that had been identified by performing analytical procedure so that it can indicate any risk of material misstatement due to fraud. Okay, so he will evaluate whether unusual relationship had been identified in performing analytical procedure indicate any risk of material misstatement due to fraud. Again, then auditor shall consider other information obtained by auditor indicate risk of material misstatement due to fraud. So he is going to understand risk of material misstatement due to fraud by evaluating unusual relationship by considering other information. You got it? And lastly, he is going to, in risk assessment procedure, he is going to evaluate FRF, fraud risk factor. You know that. Okay, so here in the risk assessment procedure, what did we understand? First of all, make inquiry from management TCWG. So secondly, here there is 2 points that you have to you have to evaluate unusual relationship so that you can understand or that it can indicate any risk of material misstatement due to fraud, or you have to consider other information so that it can indicate risk of material misstatement due to fraud. And lastly, you have to evaluate fraud risk factor. Okay, then there is a question, response to assessed risk. Okay, now you have to respond to assess risk. So auditor shall evaluate risk of material misstatement due to fraud at financial statement level, that is overall level, risk of material misstatement due to fraud at assertion level, that is a particular level, risk related to management override of control. Okay, management has made a system and they are itself, themselves they are overriding it. So here you have assessed the risk, right? So you have identified the risk. So here what are you doing? You are responding to that particular risk. Okay, so let's understand, if the risk of material misstatement due to fraud at financial statement level, overall level, you have identified this is the risk of material misstatement due to fraud at financial statement level. How will you respond to such risk? Number one, assign supervised personnel as per their capability. First of all, what you have to do, assign and supervise personnel as per their capability. Secondly, you have to check the accounting policy adopted. Your accounting policy adopted by entity that indicate fraudulent financial reporting. Okay, so here you have to check the accounting policy adopted by entity that indicate fraudulent financial reporting. And lastly, you have to do some surprise element. So what are we studying? Like you want to respond to the assessed risk, right? So auditor, in case the risk of material misstatement due to fraud at financial statement level, what you have to do? Simple, assign some personnel, assign and supervise personnel as per their capability. Number one. Then what you have to do? Simple, that this accounting policy that has been adopted by entity, check whether it indicate any fraudulent financial reporting. And lastly, incorporate surprise element in selection of nature, timing, extent. Simple surprise element, just incorporate it in the process. Okay, and then if the risk of material misstatement due to fraud is at assertion level, here what you have to do? Simple, very simple. Further audit procedure. Auditor shall perform further audit procedure to assess risk of material misstatement due to fraud at assertion level. So in case of assertion level, if there is any fraud, what you have to do? Simple, you have to learn one word: further audit procedure. Auditor shall perform further audit procedure to assess the risk of material misstatement due to fraud at assertion level. Alright, risk of material misstatement override of control. Management has made some control and they are in itself overriding it. What you have to do here in this case? How will you respond to the assessed risk? Very simple. Management has ability to manipulate the record and prepare fraudulent financial statement by overriding control. So you have to check whether management has ability to manipulate record firstly, then whether it involves a significant risk, and lastly, if yes, everything is yes, auditor therefore determine whether he needs to perform extra audit procedure. So here the word is how to respond to the essay by performing extra audit procedure. Okay, and then the two more questions in this essay is done. If auditor is unable to continue engagement, so he's not able to do engagement, what to do now? If auditor is unable to continue engagement, very simple. Check, number one, determine if it's legal and professional responsibility of the auditor to report to the person appointing him and to the regulatory authority. It's just very simple. Determine is it your legal or professional responsibility of the auditor to determine to the person who has appointed him and to the regulatory authority. If yes, then do it. Okay, so determine. You are not able to continue the engagement, right? Auditor is able to continue the engagement? No, auditor is not able to continue. What do you have to do? Check whether it is whether it is a legal or professional responsibility of the auditor to report to the person appointing him and to the regulatory authority. Okay, secondly, what you have to do? Determine whether it's appropriate to withdraw, whether the withdrawal is legally permitted, and if auditor withdraws, he shall discuss with the management TCWG and also should give reason for the withdrawal. Very simple. If auditor is unable to continue the engagement, if he is not able to do the engagement due to fraud, what he has to do? Simple, determine whether it's legal and professional responsibility of the auditor to report to the person appointing him and to the regulatory authority. Secondly, whether it is appropriate to withdraw, whether the withdrawal is legally permitted, and lastly, if the auditor withdraws, he shall discuss with the management and also should give reason for his withdrawal. And the last important question, this one is an important one: possible sources of financial fraudulent reporting. What are the possible sources of fraud? And answer is fraud. F-R-A-U-D. What are the sources of fraud? They're asking. Answer is fraud. F is fictitious journal entry. F is F-R-A-U-D. F is reporting fictitious journal entry. Okay, so what are you reporting? Fictitious journal entry. Okay, F. R is receipt, embezzlement of receipt. R is embezzlement of receipt. F-R-A. A is misappropriation of asset. A is misappropriation of asset. F-R-A-U. U is using entity asset for personal use. Using entity asset for personal use. And D is delaying, omitting recognition in the financial statement of transaction. So, what are the possible sources of fraud? Come on, quickly tell me. What are the possible sources of fraud? Possible sources of fraud is fraud. F is reporting fictitious journal entry. R is, come on, quickly tell me. R is received, embezzlement of receipt. F-R-A. A is misappropriation of asset. Misappropriation of asset. A. U is using entity asset for personal use. And D is delaying, omitting recognition in the financial statement of transaction. Alright, so it's done. Just two more points, just very simple. Like whenever fraud is discovered by auditor, what he has to do as per Company Act under section 143 subsection 12, he has to report to the central government. Okay, whenever fraud is discovered, auditor, what he has to do? As per Company Act, Section 143, subsection 12, he has to report to the central government. Okay, and also in CARO, also as per Section 143, subsection 11, he has to additional reporting requirement under CARO as per Section 143(11) issued by central government. And lastly, there will be penalty. The person committing fraud shall be liable under Section 447 of Company Act. He has to pay the penalty. So this is all very simple essay. What did we learn about 240? First of all, we understood fraud. Very simple. It's an intentional act or intentional act of deception by management, TCWG, employee, third party to obtain unjust or illegal advantage. Then we understood fraud risk factor. What is it? Some event condition, that may indicate incentive to commit fraud, pressure to commit fraud, opportunity to commit fraud. So auditor is concerned with fraud that causes material misstatement or immaterial misstatement. Material misstatement. What is the responsibility of management? Primary responsibility is for prevention and detection of fraud. What is the auditor responsibility? Very simple. For responsibility to obtain reasonable assurance whether financial statement as a whole are free from material misstatement due to fraud, maintain professional skepticism, non-detection of fraud increases audit. So try to detect fraud, and he cannot detect all the frauds. Objective, very simple. Identify, assess the risk of fraud, obtain the evidence related to fraud, and appropriately respond. And then very simple requirement of SA 240, few requirements: professional skepticism, and discuss with team, risk assessment procedure, and identification due to fraud, audit evidence evaluation, response to risk, and then keep communicating with TCW management, documentation, management representation. And then what is RAP? Here he has to make inquiry with management, TCWG, and then he has to understand the indicator of risk committal misstatement due to fraud, and then finally evaluate fraud risk factor, and then how to respond to assess risk, that you have to see that. And then lastly, if auditor is unable to continue engagement, he has to check whether is it legally and professional responsibility to report to the person appointing. If he can withdraw, he has to check whether he is appropriate to withdraw, and if he withdraws, he shall discuss with TCWG and management and shall give reason. And lastly, possible sources of fraud. Very simple. Possible sources of fraud. F is fictitious journal entry, R is embezzlement of receipt, A is misappropriation of asset, U is using entity asset for personal use, D is delaying and omitting recognition in financial statement. And lastly, three simple point here as per Section 140 Company Act 143(12). Whenever any fraud is discovered by auditor, report under that section to the central government. And additional reporting requirement under CARO under Section 143 subsection 12 issued by central government. And lastly, if the person committing fraud, liable under Section 447. Alright guys, signing off. Rocking faculty for CA final audit, and all the best.